The first thing the soldiers noticed was the silence. It was not the peaceful, natural silence of a forest or a quiet village, but a heavy, suffocating stillness that made the air feel thick and the heart beat faster, as if warning them of something unseen. When the German troops rolled across the Soviet border on June 22, 1941, under their proud banners and confident propaganda, they expected a quick and decisive campaign. Many of them believed they were entering a land that would collapse within weeks, a place too weak, too disorganized, and too vast to resist them. Yet the silence they walked into was the first sign that this was no ordinary invasion. It felt like the world was holding its breath, waiting for something terrible to unfold. And for the millions who would fight on the Eastern Front, that feeling proved to be true. They were stepping into an inferno that would burn its way into their minds forever. At first, the soldiers still carried the enthusiasm of earlier victories. France had fallen. The Balkans had fallen. Everywhere the German army marched, they had seemed unstoppable. But the moment they crossed deeper into Soviet territory, their confidence collided with a reality so harsh and alien that it began chipping away at their psychological stability from the very first days. The land stretched endlessly in every direction, flat, open plains broken only by dark forests and distant villages. Roads were crude tracks of dirt that turned to thick mud after even the slightest rain. Horses stumbled and died. Trucks broke down. Tanks disappeared into bogs. And the soldiers, who had imagined themselves advancing swiftly toward victory, soon found themselves marching endlessly under a burning summer sun that left their uniforms soaked with sweat and their throats dry as stone. But the heat was only the beginning. The invasion opened with such speed and violence that the land seemed to cry out. Towns burned in the distance. Columns of black smoke lined the horizon. Civilians fled along the roads with belongings tied to carts, their faces pale with shock. German soldiers, many barely out of their teens, saw things they had never imagined: families torn apart, buildings reduced to ash, livestock running in panic through fields littered with bodies. Some wrote letters home describing the feeling of stepping into a nightmare, where the rules of humanity seemed to vanish with every mile they advanced. The fighting intensified day by day. Unlike the Western Front, where surrender and negotiation were common, the Eastern Front quickly became a place of absolute brutality. Ideology fueled the violence. Nazi propaganda had painted Russians as subhuman enemies, while Soviet leaders declared the Germans invaders who must be resisted to the last breath. And caught between these two extremes were the soldiers, many of whom had never even traveled outside their hometowns before the war. As they moved forward, they saw executions, burned villages, and fields filled with corpses, some German, many Soviet, all equally horrifying. The smell of death clung to the air like an invisible fog, soaking deeply into uniforms and skin. By the time autumn arrived, the psychological strain was already visible. Soldiers grew restless, eyes darting at every sound. Some stopped writing letters home, unable to explain what they were witnessing. Others became cold and silent, speaking only when necessary, their personalities shifting into something unrecognizable even to themselves. It was not only fear that consumed them, but a strange numbness, a sense that the world had become unreal, that they were trapped in a place where normal emotions no longer mattered. Then came the mud. When rain swept across the front, the roads disappeared under a sea of thick, sticky sludge that swallowed boots, wheels, and morale alike. Marching even a mile became an exhausting battle. Trucks sank to their axles. Horses collapsed and died. Soldiers dragged artillery pieces with ropes like ancient slaves pulling stone blocks. Every step, every movement required effort that drained body and mind. Letters from this period are filled with descriptions of endless days, endless mud, and an endless sense of being stuck in a nightmare that refused to end. Yet the true descent into mental torment arrived with winter. One moment, the ground was wet and muddy, the next, it hardened like iron as temperatures plunged to -30 degrees Celsius and lower. It became difficult to distinguish day from night when everything was covered in white, and the sky remained gray for weeks at a time. Soldiers woke up with frost frozen in their eyelashes. Some frostbitten fingers turned black and simply fell off. Others died quietly in their sleep, discovered the next morning as cold, stiff figures covered lightly in snow. Weapons jammed. Engines froze. Food shipments stalled. Many German soldiers wore only thin coats, completely unprepared for the brutal Russian winter. Frostbite spread like a silent disease. To stay alive, soldiers slept in holes dug into the ground, huddling together for warmth. Some slept next to frozen corpses because the bodies provided insulation from the wind. And as the cold deepened, something inside the soldiers began to break. Some stared into the distance for hours without speaking. Others shook uncontrollably, not from cold, but from terror and exhaustion. A few began to hallucinate, seeing figures in the snow, hearing voices calling their names from the icy wind. For Soviet soldiers, the psychological burden was equally overwhelming but layered with additional fear. Their families were somewhere behind them, possibly in the path of German forces. Their commanders reminded them that retreat was not an option. Stalin's order No. 227, not one step back, meant that soldiers who tried to escape the battlefield could be shot by their own officers. Many Soviet troops felt trapped between death at the hands of the Germans and death at the hands of their own commanders. This constant pressure created a mental landscape filled with dread, anger, desperation, and an intense will to survive. By the end of that first winter, the soldiers on both sides had changed. The young men who had marched confidently into battle were gone, replaced by hardened survivors who had witnessed horrors beyond imagination. The Eastern Front had become more than a battlefield, it had become a psychological abyss. Every day tested not just physical strength but the ability to hold on to one's sanity in the face of cold, hunger, violence, and death. And although the war still had years to go, the trauma had already begun taking root deep, silent, and permanent in the minds of those who lived through the fiery beginning of the inferno. Title: Frozen Souls. The winter did not arrive suddenly, it crept in slowly, like a shadow stretching across the land, wrapping the soldiers in a chill that deepened day by day until they could no longer remember what warmth felt like. By late November, the snow had swallowed the fields, villages, and trenches, turning everything into a vast white desert where movement was slow, vision was blurred, and sound carried strangely through the frozen air. Soldiers stepped into this new world feeling as though they had crossed into another dimension, a place ruled not by men or armies, but by nature itself, merciless and relentless. And in this place, the trauma they carried from the first months of the campaign began to evolve into something heavier, something darker, as their bodies weakened and their minds struggled to cope with the sheer brutality of surviving each day. The cold was not simply a physical sensation, it was a psychological enemy that drilled itself into the skull. Soldiers described feeling as though the winter had a personality and intelligence, targeting them deliberately, probing their weaknesses, exhausting their strength. Some mornings, they woke with their blankets frozen stiff. Others found ice crystals forming on their uniforms. The simplest actions, buttoning a jacket, holding a spoon, loading a rifle, became battles in themselves. Fingers numbed, skin cracked, blood dried quickly in the sub-zero air. Many soldiers wrapped their feet in rags torn from uniforms of the dead because socks had long since worn out. The cold made every man question how much longer he could endure before something inside him snapped. Food became another silent torment. Supplies arrived irregularly, often after days of delay, and when they did, the rations were meager. Soup froze before reaching the trenches. Bread turned into solid blocks that had to be chopped with bayonets. Hunger gnawed at the stomach like a clawed hand. Soldiers grew thin, their cheeks hollowing, their bodies weakening. Some felt anger, others despair, and many more simply fell into a numb acceptance that hunger was now a constant companion. Yet it took a mental toll that was harder to measure. Hunger blurred thoughts, slowed reactions, and made the line between hope and resignation dangerously thin. Inside the trenches, the atmosphere was suffocating. Men packed together for warmth, sharing body heat because fire was impossible. Smoke could reveal their positions. They slept in shifts, often half awake, listening to the groans of the injured, the distant explosions, or the eerie stillness that felt more threatening than any sound. Many soldiers stopped speaking altogether except when absolutely necessary. They stared into the snow, their eyes cold and distant, as if their minds had drifted away to some hidden place where the war could not reach them. The silence among soldiers was different from the silence of the battlefield. This one was heavy with exhaustion, fear, and mental withdrawal. Yet the enemy did not disappear simply because winter had arrived. Fighting continued in brutal, fragmented bursts, small clashes, sudden ambushes, sniper shots cutting through the air without warning. A soldier could be carrying water or repairing a boot when a single bullet cracked and sent him collapsing into the snow. The randomness of death created a constant tension, a sense that fate hovered overhead, waiting to choose its next victim. Soldiers learned to move quickly, never lingering in open spaces, always scanning the distant tree line for the faintest glimmer of a scope or movement. Many developed an instinctive flinch whenever snow fell from a branch or a twig snapped under the weight of ice. In the cities, the fighting was even more suffocating. Buildings stood like frozen skeletons, their windows shattered, their interiors dark and eerily quiet. Soldiers entered these ruins constantly expecting danger. Every room might hide an enemy. Every stairway could collapse. Every shadow held the possibility of sudden death. The psychological strain of navigating these destroyed landscapes chipped away at the mind. Some soldiers described feeling as though the ruins themselves were alive, watching them, swallowing them, trapping them inside a world where escape was impossible. For the Soviet soldiers defending their homeland, the cold was familiar but no less destructive. Many came from regions where winters were harsh, yet the pressure placed on them was immense. Commanders expected them to hold positions regardless of casualties. Reinforcements arrived slowly. Ammunition sometimes ran short. Soldiers fought with gloves that had holes, coats that barely kept out the wind, and boots that froze stiff every night. Still, they pushed forward, motivated by a mixture of duty, fear, and a fierce determination not to let the invaders advance. But even with this determination, they could not escape the mental toll. Their thoughts drifted constantly to families left behind, families who might now be homeless, starving, or dead. That uncertainty pulled at them like a sickening weight, hollowing out their emotions until anger or hopelessness replaced everything else. As winter dragged on, soldiers on both sides began to experience a strange alteration of time. Days blended together into an endless repetition of cold, hunger, exhaustion, and fear. Night came early and lasted long. Some men slept most of the day, withdrawing into their minds in an attempt to escape reality. Others stayed awake for long hours, pacing restlessly, unable to relax. Dream and reality blurred. Some dreamed of warm beds, hot food, or the faces of loved ones, only to awaken to the cruel sting of frost on their skin. Others had nightmares of ambushes, explosions, or dying slowly in the snow, and these dreams clung to them long after sunrise, affecting their behavior and clouding their thoughts. Illnesses spread easily. Frostbite, pneumonia, trench foot, and infections took lives as swiftly as bullets. Soldiers watched their friends weaken, cough, tremble, and sink into delirium. Some begged for help that could not be given. Others fell silent and slipped away during the night. The sight of comrades dying not from combat but from the cold or sickness carved deep wounds in the minds of survivors. It was one thing to lose a friend in battle, to see him fall bravely in action. It was another to watch him slowly fade away, powerless to stop it. By the time winter finally began to loosen its grip, the soldiers who had endured it were not the same men who had marched in. Their bodies were scarred, their faces older, their movements slower. But the deeper damage was invisible, lodged somewhere inside their minds. The cold had not merely attacked their flesh, it had invaded their thoughts, frozen their emotions, and left behind cracks that would widen with every new hardship. The trauma of winter was not something they would leave behind when the snow melted. It had become part of them, woven into their memories, shaping how they saw the world and how they would survive the battles still to come. Title: Fire and Shadows. The battlefields of the Eastern Front were not simply places where armies clashed, they were landscapes of fire, smoke, and shadow, where the distinction between life and death seemed to dissolve in the haze of endless violence. By the time the spring thaw arrived, the soldiers had already learned that survival depended less on tactics or discipline and more on endurance, improvisation, and a willingness to confront horrors that would have shattered ordinary minds. The thaw brought melting snow, flooded fields, and mud that clung to boots like glue, but it also revealed the full scale of destruction that had accumulated over the winter months. Corpses, frozen and bloated, lay half buried in the ground, and for those walking past them, the visual impact was as jarring as the smells that lingered in the air, a mixture of decay, gunpowder, and wet earth that clung to skin and clothing and refused to wash away. Combat had shifted from the frozen monotony of the snow to a chaotic, unpredictable form of warfare. Small villages, forests, and ruined cities became sites of continuous skirmishes, ambushes, and sniper fire. Soldiers moved cautiously, scanning every window, doorway, and roofline for signs of enemy presence. Every footstep could trigger a mine. Every sound might signal an approaching patrol. The psychological strain of operating in this environment was immense. Constant vigilance was required, yet it was exhausting, and the mental burden of knowing that even a minor lapse could mean instant death wore heavily on the soldiers. Fatigue, hunger, and fear converged to create a mental landscape in which rational thought often struggled to prevail. The unpredictability of life on the Eastern Front meant that soldiers quickly learned to suppress their natural human instincts. Compassion, hesitation, and moral concern were luxuries that survival often could not afford. Witnessing civilian suffering became a daily occurrence, yet emotional responses had to be muted to continue functioning. Soldiers saw families flee their homes only to be caught in crossfire, witnessed children frozen or starved, and navigated villages turned into graveyards. These experiences chipped away at the humanity of many men, leaving behind a hardened, survival-focused mentality. Letters home often contained no mention of these horrors, because the soldiers themselves could not process them fully, and because they did not wish to worry families with stories of atrocities and fear that could not be softened. The psychological burden was intensified by the constant presence of death among comrades. Soldiers formed bonds quickly, sharing stories, meals, and small comforts in the trenches or makeshift shelters, but these relationships were always temporary. Within days or weeks, friends could be killed or gravely injured. Witnessing the slow deterioration of someone close, watching their injuries worsen from infection or untreated wounds, or listening to their final words while helpless to intervene, left lasting mental scars. Survivor's guilt became common, a quiet companion that followed men through the forested battlefields and into ruined towns. Many soldiers described feeling that every breath they took was stolen from someone else, that living itself was a betrayal. Fear on the Eastern Front was not limited to combat situations. Psychological trauma seeped into every moment. Soldiers slept with one eye open, waking at the slightest sound. They became hypervigilant, jumping at shadows, reacting to distant noises with instinctive terror. The unpredictability of guerrilla attacks, the sudden collapse of fortifications, and the omnipresent threat of artillery made it impossible to relax. Even brief moments of rest were tense and shallow, as men's minds remained alert for dangers both real and imagined. Some developed lasting nervous habits, twitching, shaking hands, or panic attacks that persisted long after they left the battlefield. The environmental conditions continued to play a significant role. Summer brought heat, insects, and the smell of decaying bodies intensified by warmth, while autumn returned the soldiers to wet and muddy conditions. Rivers swelled, cutting off units and creating logistical nightmares. Supplies were often delayed, leaving troops without food, water, or medical assistance. Disease became a persistent threat. Dysentery, typhus, and other infections spread rapidly in crowded trenches and makeshift camps. Illness was often indistinguishable from weakness in the minds of exhausted soldiers. Those who fell sick frequently suffered not only physically but emotionally, as comrades faced impossible decisions about who could be saved and who had to be left behind. For Soviet soldiers, the psychological pressures were compounded by political and ideological demands. Commanders frequently demanded attacks under conditions that defied logic, expecting men to hold lines or counterattack against overwhelming odds. Retreat was punishable by death, creating a constant internal conflict between the instinct for self-preservation and loyalty to orders. Many soldiers experienced profound fear not just of enemy fire, but of being shot by their own officers if they hesitated or faltered. The mental strain of this dual threat, enemy and authority, produced intense anxiety, anger, and, in some cases, emotional numbness that allowed men to act without moral hesitation. The battles were also punctuated by moments of extraordinary terror that left permanent marks on the psyche. Artillery barrages could reduce entire villages to rubble in minutes. Tanks crushed anything in their path. Aircraft strafed troops and civilians indiscriminately. Soldiers often described feeling detached, as if they were observing the carnage from afar, unable to process it fully in real time. This dissociation, a protective mechanism, became a coping strategy for surviving the relentless horror, yet it also contributed to long-term mental fragmentation. Some men would later recall standing amid explosions and fires, aware that comrades were dying around them, but feeling emotionally hollow, as though their own mind had been shielded from the full reality of what was occurring. Perhaps the most insidious form of trauma came not from bullets or bombs, but from moral conflict. Soldiers were often forced to act in ways that violated deeply held beliefs, whether executing prisoners, looting villages, or ignoring pleas for help. The tension between survival, duty, and conscience created profound internal conflict. Many would later report feelings of guilt, shame, or rage at themselves for acts committed under orders or under pressure. This moral injury compounded the effects of physical danger, hunger, and environmental hardship, leaving deep psychological wounds that no amount of rest could heal. By the end of these campaigns, the soldiers who survived the fire and shadows of the Eastern Front were changed forever. They had endured relentless stress, witnessed atrocities, and faced death in forms both sudden and slow. Their experiences left them scarred in ways visible only to themselves and the few who had shared those moments. Yet the war was far from over. Even as spring melted the snow and revealed the full scale of destruction, the trauma carried forward, a shadow that would lengthen with every new battle, every new loss, and every impossible choice forced upon them in a world consumed by violence. They were survivors, yes, but survival had come at a cost, one written not in medals or promotions, but in the quiet, permanent fractures of the mind. Echoes of silence. When the guns finally fell silent on the Eastern Front, the world that returned to the soldiers was nothing like the one they had left. Cities lay in ruins, forests had been stripped bare, rivers clogged with debris and bodies, and villages that once teemed with life were reduced to ash and rubble. For those who survived, victory and survival came hand in hand with a shadow that could not be shaken. The silence after the war was not comforting, it was a canvas onto which memories of violence, fear, and death were projected with terrifying clarity. The human mind, after years of witnessing unrelenting brutality, struggled to reorient itself to normal life, and many soldiers discovered that the battlefield had left marks deeper than any wound inflicted by bullets or shrapnel. The first months after the fighting ended were filled with a strange, disorienting emptiness. Soldiers returned to homes that were either destroyed or unrecognizable. Some were assigned to reconstruct cities or clean battlefields, a task that brought them into direct contact with the corpses of friends, enemies, and civilians alike. The sheer volume of death defied comprehension. Soldiers described a numbing effect, the mind shutting down in response to an overwhelming flood of sensory and emotional input. The smell of decay lingered, the sight of burned villages haunted dreams, and the constant replay of combat moments created a mental labyrinth from which there seemed to be no exit. Nightmares became common. Many veterans reported vivid, recurring dreams in which they relived ambushes, artillery strikes, or the faces of those they had failed to save. Sleep itself became a battleground. Some could not distinguish between dreams and reality, waking in panic, expecting explosions or gunfire at any moment. These symptoms, later identified as forms of post-traumatic stress, were compounded by guilt over surviving while others perished, guilt over acts committed under orders, and guilt over the moral compromises that the war had forced upon them. The term survivor's guilt barely captured the depth of the emotional burden carried silently by millions. Social reintegration was another challenge. Soldiers returned to communities that had endured the war in different ways, and civilian understanding of the horrors of the Eastern Front was limited. Friends and family often asked questions expecting normalcy, yet the soldiers found themselves unable to relate. Conversations that once would have been simple now seemed alien. The emotional isolation created a sense of detachment, a feeling that they were no longer part of the society to which they had once belonged. Many veterans withdrew, preferring solitude, the company of other survivors, or repetitive labor that allowed them to occupy their hands while their minds grappled with invisible wounds. Alcohol and other coping mechanisms became widespread. Soldiers sought ways to dull the constant mental chatter, to silence memories that refused to fade. Taverns, rationed alcohol, or even illicit means became lifelines for some, offering temporary relief but perpetuating cycles of dependency and further mental instability. For others, the trauma manifested physically. Tremors, headaches, gastrointestinal issues, and chronic fatigue became persistent companions. The mind and body, both pushed to extremes during the war, now revealed the long-term consequences of sustained trauma. Families, too, bore the invisible scars. Marriages strained under the weight of unspoken memories. Fathers struggled to connect with children they had missed growing up. Wives and siblings, unaware of the depth of psychological damage, often interpreted withdrawal or irritability as indifference or weakness. The ripple effects of trauma extended beyond the soldiers themselves, shaping entire communities and generations. In some regions, the psychological impact of the Eastern Front contributed to long-term social disruption, loss of trust, and fragmented communal bonds. Memories of extreme hardship, starvation, exposure, witnessing atrocities remained vivid, and for many, revisiting the sites of their service was almost unbearable. Yet some soldiers returned to the Eastern Front long after the war, drawn by a need to confront what had occurred, to honor fallen comrades, or to find closure. These journeys often revealed the permanence of trauma. The physical landscape had changed, but the memories were undiminished, etched into consciousness in a way that ordinary experience could not erase. Even decades later, many survivors reported lingering psychological effects: sudden panic when hearing fireworks, flashbacks triggered by loud noises, nightmares during sleep, or emotional numbness when faced with personal loss. Some became hypervigilant, unable to relax in moments of safety. Others carried guilt or shame silently, never sharing the stories of what they had endured or witnessed. These long-term consequences demonstrate the enduring legacy of psychological trauma that extended far beyond the battlefield itself, shaping lives long after the war's conclusion. Medical and psychological understanding at the time was rudimentary, and support for returning soldiers was often inadequate. Psychiatric treatments were limited, and societal recognition of trauma was minimal. Soldiers were expected to reintegrate quickly, to resume labor, farming, or military duties without addressing the invisible wounds they carried. For many, silence became the only socially acceptable response, a forced repression that protected appearances but allowed trauma to fester beneath the surface, occasionally erupting in unpredictable ways. Yet amid this landscape of suffering, survival also produced resilience. Many soldiers learned to navigate extreme stress, to tolerate uncertainty, and to function under conditions that would have shattered most minds. This resilience, forged in the crucible of one of history's most brutal fronts, shaped post-war lives in complex ways. Some channeled their experiences into rebuilding efforts, community leadership, or mentoring younger generations. Others became writers, chronicling the horrors they had endured to educate the world and preserve the memory of those lost. In all cases, the Eastern Front left an indelible mark, a reminder that trauma, once endured on such a scale, does not vanish, but instead becomes part of the fabric of individual and collective history. By the time the world began to rebuild, the soldiers of the Eastern Front had changed irrevocably. They carried scars that could not be treated with medicine or patched with bricks. Their minds, shaped by fire, ice, hunger, and violence, retained echoes of every sound, sight, and smell that had marked the war. For many, the aftermath of the Eastern Front was a lifelong struggle, a silent battle fought not on snow or mud, but in the recesses of memory. And while history records the movements of armies, the strategies of generals, and the outcome of battles, the most enduring story, the one written in the hearts and minds of those who survived, remains largely invisible, yet profoundly human, reminding us that war's cost is measured not only in territory gained or lost, but in the fragility and endurance of the human spirit.